For the sky. Hold on to your breath, hold on to your heart, hold on to your home. March up to the gate and feel it open.
Hi, I'm Ron SUCHIU, and hopefully you saw my first video about the House of the Rising Sun that I did a partnership with Eric Burdon of the Animals, and I painted the real House of the Rising Sun down in New Orleans, and I met the owner, and we had a wonderful time. And what an adventure we had! And there's one of the strangest adventures I've ever had in my entire life was the fact that Darlene owned not only the real House of the Rising Sun, but she also owned the place next door, which was called the Marble Mansion. And it was a well-known property in there because of actually some murder that happened in the house. But anyway, it was a doctor and several women, whatever. I won't get into that one. But Darlene, when we were there, she asked us if we wanted to meet Shango. Shango being the most powerful god of voodoo. And Shango, I didn't realize what she was really after. And I have a travel buddy, Gary Bergmoser, and Gary and I said, yeah, we'd be great. Let's go meet Shango. So she's going to take us over to the Marble Mansion next door. And as we were walking over there, Gary and I actually started to quiver. And these stories get weird, and I'm not into the spirits, into the occult that much, but I've had a few situations happen that seem to be almost obviously telling me that it's real. And as we were walking over there, Gary said to me, he says, I don't know why, but I'm actually starting to shiver, like quiver a bit and shake. And I said, I can't believe it. I'm doing the same thing. So we walked into the house, and there was a long hallway. And as you walk down the hallway, on the right-hand side, it was like the wall was maybe 12 or 15 feet high. And there was voodoo art all over the place and all kinds of voodoo objects. And Darlene had gone down the hallway, and at the back end of the hall, over by a staircase, she turned left into a large room with it had French doors. And then when we walked in, there was a beautiful black ebony piano, a fireplace. The room was really empty of anything else, and it also had a set of French doors going to the backyard. And as we turned the corner and walked in, Darlene said, "Let me introduce you to Shango." And we kind of looked over, and on the top of this black ebony piano, this gorgeous grand piano, there was this creature. I'm going to call it a creature, for lack of a better word. It stood about maybe 2 feet tall, and the head was in leather, it was stitched, and the actual kind of gown was done in these small shells. It was just like shells and wood and leather. And she said, and as she introduced us to Shango, and it's a clear day outside. I'm going to tell you right now, there was one small cloud that we saw in that day. She introduced us to Shango, and she had told us that Shango was the god of lightning and thunder. And as she did it, there was a flash that came through the French doors in the garden. And a few seconds later, maybe 10 seconds later, you hear the rumble of thunder. And I looked at Darlene and I said, like, wow, that's incredible. You even got the sound effects. And when I did that, a huge flash and bang at the same time, and it shook the French doors. Believe me or don't believe me, that's fine. But that's exactly how it happened. And I looked over at Gary, and Gary was white as a ghost. I swear to God, he almost piddled on the floor a bit, because, you know, his jaw dropped. I was sitting there like, what's this all about? And I looked over at Darlene. Darlene says, when it comes to voodoo, you don't have to believe, but you don't joke. You never joke about it. And she said, you don't realize how powerful this god is. And I said, well, it's a statue, right? And she said, no, no, no. This is not a statue. This is actually Shango. Shango had been taken from a tribe, and it was believed to be about 5,000 years old, and she had purchased it off an auction for many, many, many thousands of dollars a few years back. And so we were actually introduced to the real god Shango at that point. And then I was so impressed with that, you know, I asked, can I actually put Shango in the painting? And she was very reserved on that. Like, she kind of backed up. She said, look, if you do something like that, I've got to, as a lawyer, I do have to warn you. There is consequences that can happen. And one thing was, you're never supposed to take a picture of a god of voodoo. And when you take the picture of the god, you're actually taking part of their soul. And Eric Burdon had told me when I visited the altar, the voodoo altar, which is in the backyard, which I'll tell you about in a second here, he said you have to actually mark that you were there and leave a gift. And just to speed up things right now, I actually didn't do that. But we'll get back to that in a minute. So when we were in that room, I said to Darlene, this is really an amazing thing. Could I actually have the voodoo altar set up in the back, and could I take pictures? And she says, yes, you can do that, but I'm not going to be responsible for what happens. So we had, when we were back in the back of the House of Rising Sun, she had introduced us to a really debonair black man. His name was James, and when Darlene introduced us, said she had to go back to work because she's a busy lawyer. And she said, James, this is Mr. SUCHIU, and you do anything he asks, you get him anything he needs. Darlene took the moment to actually explain other situations that happened with Shango. And she actually, a couple times, had parties in that room. The House of Rising Sun was never open to the public, and she only invites who she wants to invite. So she had a VIP party at the house to tour the House of Rising Sun. And then she had brought him back to this room where the grand piano and Shango was. And somebody else was actually joking about Shango, and what he did was, or he or she, was to shut down the power for the house. And I you know, you look at Darlene's like, you know, can this be real? And I'll tell you, when you saw it in her eyes, I mean, as real as it gets. And she's such a powerful lawyer, like, you have to believe her. I mean, her credibility is beyond none. But anyway, it happened twice, and both times she had to have them apologize to Shango in Shango's manner of apology. So even when I did this, I said, well, you know, how do I make this up to Shango? And she said, well, Shango's a very vain god, and you have to actually fondle Shango, which is bizarre. But I said, well, how do I do that? And she said, well, just walk up and pet Shango. And I thought it was such a privilege, because it's almost Indiana Jones here. I mean, this is as cool as it gets, that here I am with one of the 7 gods of voodoo, the most powerful god, and Darlene is asking me to walk up and touch it and to, you know, fondle it. And it was really neat just to get a chance to hold it. So anyway, back to the backyard now with James. And when we went back to the backyard, we were going to actually photograph this with James. James, first off, would not put Shango on the top of where he or she could have or should have been, because he knew what we were up to was really not something that is in proper protocol for voodoo. And he just didn't want a thing to do with that. So I actually put the camera down. I had a really nice camera, and it was easy to set up. So I said, well, we just want to get a shot. And I got a few shots myself of the voodoo altar. I got a few shots of Shango. And then I said to Gary, why don't you stand over here? At least we could have a shot together. And James would not take a picture of us. And I looked at James and said, come on. I said, just take a picture, one picture of us. He says, no, I can't do that. And I said, well, you know, Darlene told you anything I wanted for you to do, you were supposed to do. And I was being kind of humorous with it. And he said, no. I said, so even if you got fired over this, you wouldn't take a picture for me? He says, no, I wouldn't take a picture. He said, doesn't matter what happens to me. And then I found out, I learned about this later through my own experience, why it was so important. So there we are, we're with Shango, and we went into the House of Rising Sun. We had the House of Rising Sun for the whole afternoon. We got many stories from her, and this is stuff that I'll go into in much better depth when it comes to the House of the Rising Sun, explaining the actual House of the Rising Sun. But I had a voodoo curse, and the title of this video is the Voodoo Curse, and it's also called Grigri. And when we were heading back after our photo shoot was done and everything. Gary and I were heading back down St. Louis, back into the French Quarter, and we had a beautiful hotel waiting for us to go down and relax. And my eye started to burn, and I didn't understand it. It was my left eye, just around the outside of my eye was burning. And as I'm walking along, I said, I don't know, maybe I got something on because I was taking pictures of Shango and all of the House of Rising Sun, and I have a rubber, like an eye guard on it, and I thought maybe I touched it to some plant in the garden. And Gary looked at my eye, says it looks fine, and my face was starting to burn. And then by the time we went a few blocks, my actual side of my head was starting to burn, and was starting to go down my neck. And I said to Gary, God, I don't feel good. There's something going on here. So we stopped in. He said, well, let's go sit down. We'll have a beer, right? So we stopped in the local pub there, and we're sitting there, and I'm trying to have a beer. I said, no, I've got to get back to the hotel. I'm starting to feel actual woozy about it. I thought I was being poisoned. And by the time I got to the hotel room, from what I hear, and I don't remember getting there, but I actually did not wake up for 18 hours. And Gary, I hit the bed somehow, and I would not even budge. And Gary was actually calling my wife, Colleen, to make arrangements in case something was to happen to me, because he had called the doctor, he had called Darlene, and Darlene says, well, she said, I warned Ron about that because it sounds like Gree. And the doctor, believe it or not, said the same thing. She actually referred to a doctor for us. And anyway, so I was out of it. Like, I literally might be being sent home in a body bag as far as Gary was concerned. It was the most, terrifying thing for him. And he came in the next day, and I was still, never made a motion. I never moved on the bed. And he shook me and shook me and shook me until I actually opened my eyes. And he says, come on. And he dragged me out of bed. I'm still in the clothes from the day before. And he says, let's go up to the roof. And I didn't know what was on the roof. And he says, I know there's a place up there that has the cure. And he says, we call it the Barnes cure. And I guess what he was doing is he spoke to Darlene. And Darlene said that, voodoo curses really a lot of times are a psychological curse. So she said, all you have to do is find a way for him to believe that the curse is broken, and it might work. So what he did is we went up onto the roof of the building. There's a beautiful open air bar up there. And Gary says, I'm getting you the Barnes cure. It'll work. I guarantee it. And what he did is he bought me a bottle of beer. And he says, drink this in one shot. He says, I've been talking to Darlene. This will work for you. Drink it in one shot and don't stop. Just glug it back. And I did it. And by the time I got done the bottle, I felt like $1 million. And I literally, I know it sounds so weird, but that literally happened. I'm standing there, and I said, what's happened? And he told me the whole story, and he says he's calling Colleen now to say we got it fixed here. And I got on the phone with Colleen, and Colleen couldn't believe it, like the difference in what was going on with me then. And it took it's seconds, right? And I never felt better my entire life. So that is part of the voodoo curse. And after that, I think about a year later, I actually went on a trip, and my way of actually making up to Shango, and I confided with Darlene, how could I do this, make it up? And she said, well, do stuff for Shango or with Shango. So I had a picture of Shango, and I took a trip by myself because I'm a bit of I was a bit of a nervous traveler at the time. And I was on vacation by myself. My wife and daughter we couldn't arrange to have vacations at the same time. So I went and I toured all of California in a car. I just rented a car, and I put Shango in the passenger window as the picture, and Shango went with me everywhere I went. So we're going to zoom ahead 6 months. And don't forget, we were down there to do a picture of the House of Rising Sun as a partnership with Eric Burdon. And I did the painting, and I did it. I put it in, and I put Shango in the painting. And one day at home, and people don't know me, I don't get sick. I don't know why, but I just don't get flus or anything or colds. So one day I was woke up and I said, Colin, I can't go to work today. I never felt more sick, you know, for months and months and months. And even when I had the curse, the Shango curse, it wasn't like I felt sick. But when I woke up, I couldn't go into work. I could not barely get myself out of bed. So she said, well, just stay home and I'll check with you through the day. And about 3:15 that day, I was in bed. I was just out of it for the whole day. And Colleen called me, and I remember it was 3:15. And she said, so how are you feeling now, Ron? I said, well, like in the last couple of minutes, it's just started to go away and I feel great. When we actually do a print, we have a photo shoot. And they just finished shooting the actual photo for Shango. And when they were finished it, all of a sudden I got better. So all that day they were preparing and they were actually taking my painting and they were working with it with Shango, but again with a camera. So, you know, when you take a piece of a voodoo soul, you have to find a way to make good for that. And it happens in a lot of cultures. It's not only that. I mean, if you go to the West Coast, David Suzuki invited me to the West Coast several times. One time was to go on a cruise up the West Coast and to visit native spots that are not open for the public. And he said, David said, but even then, if you go, you don't take pictures of the totems. You don't take pictures because you're actually stealing a part of their spirit. So anyway, that's the Voodoo Curse. I am alive today. The prints are out there. It's been a wonderful experience for me. And there are more parts of the story. And the next story will be about Nelson Mandela.